Welcome to Pillowtime Lore, where dreams take shape and stories wrap around you like your favorite blanket. You've made it through the day, and now it's time to slow down, breathe deeply, and drift into a world made just for you. So, fluff up your pillow, snuggle into your coziest spot, and let your eyes get heavier with each word. This is your moment. No to-do lists, no noise, just stillness and a little magic. With each breath in, feel the tension melt from your shoulders. With each breath out, let go of everything that doesn't serve your peace. You're safe here. Tonight's story is soft and soothing, like a warm cup of tea for your thoughts, carefully crafted to calm your busy mind and help you drift gently into sleep. So close your eyes, dear dreamer. Let your imagination wander while I carry you into a land where anything is possible and everything ends in peace. This is Pillowtime Lore. The sky had turned the softest shade of gray as the cousin's car wound its way through narrow mountain roads, flanked by pine trees heavy with fresh snow. Their breath fogged the car windows as they pressed their noses to the glass. Eyes wide with excitement, Leela, the oldest at 11, pointed out snow-covered deer tracks along the roadside. Theo, her 10-year-old brother, claimed he saw a bear, which was very unlikely. Max, their cousin from the city, clutched his sketchbook, already scribbling the trees, and Rosie, the youngest, at 7, bounced with joy, her woolly hat slipping over her eyes. "Are we almost there?" Rosie asked for the 5th time, her voice muffled by the scarf wrapped tightly around her face. "Just one more bend," their mother answered, smiling through the rear-view mirror. The car finally creaked to a halt outside a log cottage nestled in a clearing. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and golden lights shimmered from inside, glowing like a warm secret in the snowy quiet. The children tumbled out into the snow, boots crunching, laughter echoing through the crisp mountain air. "Welcome to Snowdrop Cottage." Grandpa's voice boomed as he opened the front door wide. He wore his usual flannel shirt, suspenders, and a knit beanie that had clearly been mended more than once. Grandma followed, wiping her hands on her apron, cheeks pink from the kitchen. Heat inside. The cottage smelled like cinnamon, baked bread, and wood smoke. The fire crackled cheerfully, and knit stockings hung from the mantel. A row of mugs sat ready on the counter-reach, with a different-colored marshmallow floating. In hot chocolate, coats were peeled off, socks were warmed, and cheeks defrosted. Theo ran upstairs to claim the room with the sloped ceiling, while Lila carefully unpacked her journal and sketch pens. Rosie climbed into Grandma's lap without asking, and was promptly fed a spoonful of warm chicken stew. Max stood still. For a moment, soaking it all in. It was his first winter visit to the mountains, and everything felt magical. The ticking of the old clock, the creak of wooden floors, the way the snow outside blurred the world into white hush-it was all different from the noisy buzz of city life. After dinner, Grandpa lit the old lanterns on the porch, and the cousins huddled under thick quilts, sipping cocoa and watching the snow fall. The adults chatted softly in the kitchen, their voices like a lullaby in the background. "We should build a snow fort tomorrow," Theo whispered. "Or sled down the back hill," Lila added. "Or play hide and seek," Rosie said, her eyes gleaming. Max didn't say much, but he was already sketching the trees he'd seen, trying to capture the feeling of this place, this cabin, where time slowed down and the world felt gentle. That night, they all slept. In the upstairs room under one giant blanket, outside, snow fell silently, blanketing the cottage like icing on a cake. No one knew yet what adventures the coming days would bring. But as Lila whispered goodnight and Rosie snored softly, beside her, a small, quiet thrill filled the room. The cousins were finally together, and winter had just begun. The next morning, the cousins awoke to a silver world. Snow had fallen all night, wrapping the hills in fresh powder that sparkled in the early sun. After a breakfast of warm pancakes and honey butter toast, the children bundled up in layers and tumbled out the cottage door like a pack of giggling puppies. "Let's go to the woods today," Theo shouted, already halfway down the porch steps. "Hide and seek," Rosie declared, hopping excitedly behind him. Max hesitated at the threshold, tightening his scarf and adjusting his sketch pad in his coat pocket, just in case. The forest that edged their grandparents' property looked quiet, white, their heavy branches drooping with snow. The game began near the edge of the woods. Lila counted loudly, while the others scattered between trees and snowy bushes. The crunch of boots and the squeal of laughter filled the crisp air. Max ducked behind a tree, then changed his mind and dashed deeper into the woods, drawn by the untouched snow and his curiosity. That's when he saw them. Footprints, small, almost child-size, leading deeper into the forest. Max frowned. They weren't Theo's or Rosie's. They were too neat, and they didn't match his own. "Probably old," he muttered, but something made him follow them anyway. The tracks led him between two large boulders, past a snow-covered log, and onto a gentle slope. That's when he saw it, a faint glow, way up on the mountain. It flickered like firelight, or perhaps a lantern swaying in the wind. Max's breath caught. He wasn't scared, not yet, just puzzled. He turned back, but the thick snow had already started softening the path. His footprints were fading. Panic crept in. "Lila," he called out. No answer. "Theo." Silence. He scrambled back the way he came, heart thumping. Eventually, he spotted Lila and Theo through the trees. Rosie was jumping and waving her mittens. "Where were you?" Lila asked, breathless. "We were looking for you." Max didn't answer immediately. He pointed up the slope instead. "I saw a light. Up there, like a fire. Maybe someone's there." Theo raised an eyebrow. "On the mountain." "There's no one up there. There's nothing up there," Lila added, more to reassure herself than the others. Rosie didn't say anything. She had gone unusually quiet. but Max looked serious. "I swear I saw it." They stood together, staring up at the slope. The light had vanished, but now that it was mentioned, it felt like something was up there watching, not in a scary way, but like the mountain held a secret. "We should go back," Lila finally said, brushing snow off her coat. "It's getting cold." But the mystery lingered in their minds, unspoken, that evening, around the fire. Max told Grandpa what he'd seen. The old man paused, poking at the logs. Grandpa said, thoughtfully, "Old Jonas used to live up there. Used to keep a lantern burning outside all winter long. Said he liked the company of stars and snow." "Is he still there?" Max asked. Grandpa shook his head. "Don't think so. Haven't seen a light there in years." The cousins exchanged glances, but when Max peeked out the window later that night, just for a second, he saw it again. The flicker, the glow. The others were asleep, but Max wasn't dreaming. The next afternoon, the snow had settled deeper into the woods, clinging to every branch and stone. The cousins sat bundled near the fireplace, sipping cocoa and arguing over board games. But Max's eyes kept drifting to the frost-covered window. He finally said it. "Let's go see it." "The light?" Lila asked. Max nodded. "I saw it again last night. Same spot." Theo leaned forward, suddenly interested. "Maybe it is old Jonas." Rosie hugged her stuffed bear tighter. "What if it's not?" Lila sighed. "We're not seriously hiking up a mountain because Max saw a flicker, right?" Max looked at her steadily. "You didn't see it like I did. That was enough." Curiosity won. Bundled in their thickest jackets, scarves, and snow boots, they set off in the early afternoon. Max led the way with quiet determination. The woods greeted them like a maze of silver and shadow. Puffy clouds moved above them, turning the light into a soft gray glow. The crunch of their steps and the occasional call of a bird were the only sounds. They moved deeper than before past the slope where Max had first seen the light. Fog began to roll between the trees like low clouds, muffling their giggles and chatter. Theo paused. "Guys, listen." Silence. No birds, no wind. Even the crunching had stopped. The forest felt taller somehow, stretched and older. Rosie clung to Lila's coat. "I don't like it here." "It's okay," Lila whispered. "We're just a scream." Cut her off. Rosie was gone. She had been holding Lila's sleeve just a second ago. Now, nothing. Just a faint drag mark in the snow. No struggle. No footprints. "Rosie," Theo shouted, spinning in circles. "Rosie." Max ran back a few steps, scanning every tree. She was just here. Lila's voice shook. We didn't even hear her move. Panic hit hard. They split up just enough to check behind trees and rocks, calling her name over and over. Nothing. Then Max froze. Through the fog, up the path ahead, that same flickering light had returned. Just barely visible, like a candle floating midair. "Guys," he whispered. "Look." They all turned. The light swayed slowly, as if waiting. Max's heart pounded. It was either a trap or help. Theo gritted his teeth. Either way, we follow it, and just like that, the chase began. Rosie. Lila's voice echoed through the trees, sharp and panicked. She ran back down the path, heart racing, eyes darting between snowbanks and tree trunks. Rosie, where are you? Theo cupped his hands over his mouth. Rosie, no answer. Max scanned the snow like a detective. There's something here, he crouched, pointing. It's like her footprints just stop. Lila dropped beside him. That's impossible. You don't just vanish mid-step. Theo turned in a slow circle. Unless something took her that made everyone freeze. Don't say that, Lila hissed. But Max's eyes stayed fixed on the snow. There's something weird. Look. Next to Rosie's trail was a second set of prints, not boot prints, not even human, paw prints, huge, clawed, deep. Theo's voice dropped to a whisper. That's not a dog. Lila's breath caught a bear. Max shook his head, too narrow, but definitely wild. A low growl rolled through the trees, soft, distant, and very, very real. All three spun around, backs to each other. The fog seemed thicker now, swallowing their breath as fast as their voices. Back to back, Theo said. Max pulled out the mini flashlight from his coat pocket and flicked it on. A weak beam of yellow light barely cut through the mist. Branches creaked above them. Snow flumped down in clumps from the trees. But every little sound felt like something moving. Okay, Lila breathed. Okay, we need a plan, Theo whispered. What if Rosie's hiding from it? What if it took her? Max whispered back. Shut up, Lila snapped. Don't think like that. Suddenly cracked. Something moved fast between the trees. A dark blur, too fast to track. Max shined his flashlight toward it but saw only shadows and swirling snow. Then, faintly giggle, all three turned. That was Rosie, Theo said. They bolted toward the sound, slipping through drifts, branches slapping their faces. The paw prints veered off, deeper into the forest, but the giggle had come from the opposite direction. Rosie. Lila screamed again, and this time Finette's voice replied, Lila. It was far high-pitched, confused. Rosie. Stay where you are, Max shouted. They ran toward her voice, hearts pounding, praying they weren't too late. But none of them noticed. Behind them, a dark figure moved between trees, tall, hunched, and watching. The wild wasn't done with them yet. Over here, a deep, steady voice called out from the trees. Lila, Max, and Theo skidded to a stop, snow spraying everywhere. From the fog emerged a tall figure wrapped in a heavy coat, holding a lantern that glowed like warm honey. His beard was silver and his eyes kind. Come, she's safe, he said gently. The cousins hesitated, but then Rosie came bounding into view, mitten waving and grinning. Lila. Max. I'm okay, she shouted. Lila nearly collapsed from relief, running up to squeeze her sister so tight. Rosie squeaked. I followed a deer, Rosie explained sheepishly. But then I couldn't find the way back. I found her. Near my traps, the old man added, adjusting his lantern. Lucky for both of us. Now let's get out of this cold. That growl you heard wasn't your imagination. The kids exchanged a terrified look. I knew that wasn't wind, Theo muttered. He led them through a narrow, pine-lined path until a small log cabin appeared, half buried in snow. Lanterns flickered in the windows, and a curl of smoke twisted from the chimney. Inside, the warmth hit them like a hug. The cabin was simple wooden shelves, lined with old books, a stone fireplace crackling, and thick rugs muffling their steps. Rosie sat wrapped in a blanket, sipping soup from a clay bowl. You must be freezing, the man said, handing mugs of hot cocoa to the others. Sit, rest, you're safe now. Max looked around curiously. Are you Jonas? The old man chuckled. Close. Name's Alder. Jonas was my uncle. This was his cabin once, the one Grandpa told us about. Lila asked. Mr. Alder nodded, his eyes crinkling. Still keep the lantern burning. Old habit. Theo leaned back, cocoa in hand. Well, Mr. Alder, your timing was perfect. There's something big out there. Mr. Alder's face grew serious. That mountain has its secrets. Best not to wander too far after dark. The cousins sipped their cocoa in silence, huddled near the fire, warmth finally sinking into their bones. But a thought lingered in Max's mind. If Jonas was gone, and Mr. Alder lived alone, who or what had lit the lantern the first night? The snow howled softly outside, the fire cracked, and no one dared ask out loud. As the wind whispered outside, the cousins slowly began to feel at ease. The warmth of Mr. Alder's cabin seeped into their bones, and the shadows no longer felt so ominous. Instead, the flickering lantern light made everything glow like a page from a storybook. Rosie was curled up in a rocking chair, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled faintly of pine and cedar. Max sat near the hearth, sipping his cocoa, mesmerized by the dancing flames. Lila and Theo explored the cabin with quiet curiosity. Every shelf and surface was filled with wonders. Small hand-carved animals lined the mantel, each one more detailed than the last. A wooden owl with feathered grooves sat beside a fox mid-lep. There were painted stones, whittled whistles, and tiny wooden puzzles that clicked and clacked in satisfying ways. What is all this? Theo asked, holding up a carved hedgehog. Mr. Alder smiled from his armchair. Just bits and pieces I've made over the years. Keeps the hands busy during long winters. Lila pulled a thick book from the shelf and opened it inside. Were hand-painted sketches of the forest, its animals, plants, and strange symbols. You painted these? Every one, he replied. The forest speaks. If you take the time to listen, every rustle, every ripple in the stream, every bird song, it's all telling a story. Max set down his mug, wide-eyed, so that dear Rosie followed. Was it part of the story? Mr. Alder leaned forward, his eyes twinkling. Maybe. Or maybe it was just a deer, But magic doesn't always mean spells and dragons. Max, sometimes it's in the quiet things. A trail only you notice, a light that only flickers. For you, Rosie looked around the cozy room and whispered, "It's kind of like the forest knew we were coming." Mr. Alder nodded slowly. Maybe it did. The wind outside quieted, and the room settled into a peaceful stillness. It didn't feel like they were hiding from something anymore. It felt like they had stumbled into something ancient and welcoming. Theo chuckled, poking Max. "And you thought this was going to be boring?" Max didn't respond. He was staring at a painting above the fireplace, one of a starry mountain sky with a small glowing lantern in the distance. It looked exactly like the light he'd seen, but the painting was dated 5 years ago. Mr. Alder stood, collecting the mugs. Time to rest, little explorers. There's room in the loft for you all. As they climbed the creaky wooden stairs to the sleeping loft, wrapped in thick quilts and warm cocoa dreams. None of them noticed the owl carving's eyes glint in the firelight, and just outside the window, high on the ridge, the mountain lantern flickered once more. Morning broke over the snow-blanketed hills, casting a soft golden light through the foggy trees. The forest, once eerie and unknown, now felt like a place of secrets and warmth. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney of Mr. Alder's cabin, and inside, the children were stirring from the best sleep they'd had in days, tucked into patchwork quilts, bellies full of cocoa and soup, hearts calmed by stories. The silence of the morning was broken by a distant crunching boots. In snow, voices calling through the woods. Lila, Max, Theo, Rosie, Grandpa's voice. Rosie scrambled to the window and gasped, "They're here." Outside, a line of bundled figures was moving through the trees. Grandma and Grandpa at the front, followed by 2 men from the local search team, one with a long walking stick, the other waving a red flag. The cabin door creaked open, and the cousins spilled out into the bright snow, shouting in unison, "We're here." Grandma dropped her lantern in the snow and ran. Oh, thank heavens. She wrapped them all into one massive hug, her eyes watery behind her fogged glasses. Grandpa wasn't far behind, ruffling Max's hair and grabbing Theo by the shoulders. "You kids gave us the biggest scare of our lives, but we're okay," Lila said quickly. "Really, we found the light, and Mr. Alder." All eyes turned as Mr. Alder stepped out of the cabin, a little bashful in his wool coat and mismatched mittens. His white beard glittered with frost, and his kind eyes crinkled with amusement. "I don't get many visitors," he said with a chuckle. "But when I do, they usually show up in a snowstorm." The searchers stared, surprised. One of them, a tall man with a radio, leaned toward Grandpa and whispered, "I thought this place was abandoned. Didn't think anyone still lived up here." Mr. Alder just smiled, saying nothing. Rosie tugged on Grandma's coat. "He helped me when I got lost. He made soup and has carved owls and everything. It wasn't scary at all. Max nodded. He told us stories about the forest, about how it's full of magic, just not the kind people expect. Grandpa stepped forward and shook Mr. Alders's hand. Thank you, truly. You've taken care of the most important things in our world. Mr. Alder shrugged modestly. Just did what anyone would have done. The forest has a way of guiding folks to where they need to be. The search party insisted on walking the kids down the mountain trail, but before they left, Rosie dashed back to Mr. Alder and gave him a tight hug around the knees. I'm gonna come visit again, he laughed softly, patting her head. You do that. Bring stories of your own next time. As they headed back through the trees, Leela glanced over her shoulder. The cabin already looked like it was disappearing into the woods, again like it had never been there at all. Theo nudged Max. Do you think it'll still be there if we come back? Max smiled. Only one way to find out, and just for a moment, behind the trees, they thought they saw the faint flicker of a lantern, watching, waiting, welcoming. The morning sun glinted off icicles hanging from the trees as the kids stood once more outside Mr. Alder's cabin. Now familiar and beloved, the forest, bathed in golden light, felt less mysterious, now like a dear friend they had come to understand. The smell of pine needles and wood smoke hung in the crisp air, and the snow beneath their boots crunched gently as they shuffled, reluctant to leave. Mr. Alder stood at his doorway with a small bundle in his hands. His cheeks were pink from the cold, and his eyes sparkled with that same gentle mischief they'd grown to love. I've got something for each of you, he said, his voice warm like a wool sweater. A little something to remind you of this place and what it's taught you. He handed Max the first charm, a small, smooth carving of a wolf. For courage, he said, placing it gently into Max's mittened hands. To remind you that wandering far can lead to great discovery, but only if you're brave enough to keep going. Max nodded, his throat tight, his usual loud self suddenly quiet. Then he turned to Lila and gave her a charm shaped like a little fox, curled in sleep. For curiosity, he said with a wink. Your questions will always lead you to the most unexpected magic, Lila beamed, holding it to her chest like a treasure. Theo's charm was an owl, wings outstretched. Mid-flight, for wisdom, Mr. Alder murmured, and knowing when to listen to the forest. To others, and to yourself, Theo managed a shy smile, his eyes shining behind his glasses, and for Rosie, a tiny acorn with a carved heart on it. For care, Mr. Alder said softly, kneeling to her level. Because kindness grows into the strongest of trees. Rosie hugged him again, tightly this time, as if trying to squeeze the whole memory into her little arms. Will you still be here next year? She asked, her voice muffled in his coat. Mr. Alder smiled. I've been here a long time, little one. I'll be here when the snow falls, again if your hearts bring you back. The cousins took one last look at the cabin, with its smoking chimney, creaky wooden porch, and stacks of firewood. Somehow, it already looked like it was fading into the mountain again, like a dream slowly being tucked away. The hike back down was lighter this time. They knew the path. The fear was gone. Leela picked up a pinecone. Max traced shapes in the snow with a stick. Rosie collected feathers. Theo carried his charm in his pocket and kept glancing over his shoulder just to see if the cabin was still there. When they returned to the grandparents' house, the warm scent of fresh bread and cocoa greeted them. Grandma hugged them tightly again. Even though she'd done it a dozen times already, Grandpa sat them down at the kitchen table, where they burst into excited retellings, half talking over one another, voices full of wonder. That evening, after dinner, Max pulled out a sheet of paper and began sketching the forest path. Lila grabbed colored pencils. Theo wrote down the things Mr. Alder had told them. Rosie taped her feather next to the drawing of the cabin. "We should make a map," Max said. "A real one," Lila agreed, "with landmarks. Like the hollow log, the frozen stream, Mr. Alder's cabin. We'll call it the Map of Magic Things." Rosie chimed in, grinning, and so they did. By the time the fire burned low and the night wrapped around their grandparents' home, the map was pinned to the wall above their bunk beds. Their charms rested beside their pillows, and as they drifted off to sleep, each one silently made a promise. "We'll go back next winter. We'll find the light again, and maybe, just maybe, Mr. Alder would be waiting, lantern glowing, soup simmering, and a new story to tell." The end, for now.